Okay, thank you for coming back. I think we lost a few people. I need to do a better job on the morning slides. So this session is on building open source program office, okay? So it covers what is an open source program office. We abbreviate it as OSPO, OSPO. Organizational model, staffing, roles, challenges, and then I have a section on the Samsung experience. So what is an OSPO, Open Source Program Offices? In a very simple description, it is the program office that oversees open source work within a given company. So you can be in the energy sector, you can be in consumer electronic, you can be in network, you can be in telecom. A lot of these companies working with open source actually have established an open source program office to manage open source from a consumption, from a compliance, contribution, and community perspective. And this is not a new thing. In the past few years, the term Open Source Program Office, OSPO, didn't exist. It's just something new. But the concept has existed for at least 20 years. In 2000, IBM established the Linux Technology Center. So although it's called Linux, the focus is not just Linux. It's Linux and open source. I think in 2002, Intel established the OTC, Open Source Technology Center. And since then, many companies have established this kind of program office under different names. And the naming convention started to standardize around OSPO maybe like 4 or 5 years ago. And I think I mentioned earlier this morning, even in 2000, when I was working at Ericsson, we had a similar lab, except it was called Open Systems Lab, right? So the terminology is different, but the end result of what this function does is the same. So benefits of open source programs. This slide and few other slides are coming from a survey that the Linux Foundation's TODO Group has done with the new stack. So the TODO Group is an umbrella organization in the Linux Foundation that brings together a little over 100 companies who have an open source program office in OSPO, basically for sharing practices and collaborating on common tooling and policies and processes. And every year, they make a survey. They run a survey across their companies and other companies and collect the results and produce these charts. So you can actually go to the website, to the GitHub account of TODO. So it's github.com/TODO Group, and you will find the results of the survey for 2018, 2019, and now they're doing 2020. So this is the source of the slide. It's also, it's available for anyone. So the benefits. So why would company want to establish an open source program office? Okay, and these are the results of the survey: is to create more awareness within the company, to drive development, have better compliance, do better contributions. So it's basically, there are really a lot of recognized benefits for establishing this entity within a company. And a lot of these answers are actually coming from companies who have an open source program office. So how do you structure a program office for open source? And remember, an open source program office is responsible for driving the contributions, for in many cases for making sure the company complies with the licenses, responsible for using the consumption, responsible for community, and generally relationship with foundations and everything open source in that sense. So this chart is actually empty on purpose because many companies don't have an OSPO. They just have different people in different teams, different departments, different divisions, doing bits and pieces, but there's no structure, okay? So there's no OSPO. Very simple. It was the easiest chart to create. So several companies have what you call a virtual. So there's no head of OSPO, there's no dedicated staff, but we know that there are resources in engineering who do some work, There's somebody in legal advising on the licensing. There's people supporting with marketing, events, evangelism. There's somebody in corporate development focusing on supply chain, open source coming through vendors. And there's somebody in IT helping us with systems and tooling. Okay, but there's no kind of head of OSPO. There's no structure, cost center, and things like that. It's a spread out. And this is typical in either newcomers as a company trying to figure out what model will work for them. And it's also very typical in small company, and startups where they don't necessarily need a dedicated staff because the company fits in a single room and everybody is aware of who's doing what and so on. So there's an independent organization with engineering resources, okay? And this actually chart is very specific to the organization I had at Samsung. So we were structured under Samsung Research. And there's multiple areas in research, and open source is one of them, okay? And within open source, I had kind of three functions. I had engineering, where I had my engineers structured in different teams based on the focus area. We have a strategy, and then we have a team and a support team. And of course, you can take that and customize it to your own company. Many OSPO, many offices don't have engineering functions because engineers are spread everywhere. So in my setup, Samsung had over 40,000 developers. So whether I have 100 or 20, it doesn't make much difference from engineering perspective. But the engineers that were on my team were 100% exclusively focused on upstream development. So they don't work on products, they don't work on services, and we don't respond to product and services in that perspective. We focus on supporting and enabling critical open source projects that we rely on in the products. So in some companies that are fairly large, every division might have its own OSPO. So you will have a corporate level open source team who focuses more on policies, processes, tooling, relationship with foundations, launching new projects, and so on. And every division might have their own OSPO, which basically takes the corporate level policies and they have their own implementation of them. Because the mobile division is different than the appliances. The people making the mobile phone have different requirements, different needs than the people making the fridges and the smart vacuum cleaner and so on. But all the policies and policies are done at a corporate level and pushed down and customized based on the specific needs of any given division. And you see this setup is exclusive to large companies. I'm talking companies with 10, 20, 30, 150,000 employees, and I've worked in companies, Samsung was over 300,000 employees, okay? So you can imagine the need to scale in this way. In many cases, an open source division is actually put under engineering. It's kind of a natural place for it, especially if, because the engineers are doing the work. And so you can see under engineering, you can have one function, head of open source. Some companies call it director of open source or VP of open source. And then under legal, you have the counsel, and the marketing, you have developer relations. So there are some other companies have it under the CTO. So all of this to say there are no right or wrong way of where should you create your open source program office. Should we put it under engineering, under CTO? Should it be at a corporate level? It's basically every company is different. And what I see basically looking at different companies we work with is companies experiment. So in one given company, I was reporting to SVP of engineering. Then they moved me to SVP of business development. And then a year later, I was under legal. So, so we experiment, and what works, you stick with it. And don't worry of focusing too much time on how should the office should be structured, where it should report, and all of this, because most likely you're going to change. And you start with one setup, and you find a better setup, and you move to it. And maybe in 2 years, your requirements change, and how you operate change, and then you change again. So not a single setup that fits everyone. So every company is different. So in terms of staffing, again, it also depends on the structure you have. So some OSPOs are only 4 or 5 people for a large company because it's only the head of it and a couple of people to support, and all the engineering is done across the company. And in other companies, OSPO can be a few hundred people. So some companies have, like IBM, I think it's around 500 people. Intel is about 2,000 people. And so there's no, it really depends on how you structure it. But there are always what I call essential staff that you need to have in a program office, an open source program office that oversees all the open source work. The first one is obviously you need the head. You need somebody who runs the office. And that person is kind of an intersection of different skills. Technical background is a requirement. Understanding of open source licenses, licensing regimes, CLAs, DCOs, and a lot of other things is really critical. And also, generally, kind of a good knowledge of how companies run and how to structure operation in a given company. Because at a high level, this is program management, except it's program management at a company level, not at a product level or a project level. Another critical staff is software architects, and I think there are a few architects in this room, right? So from an open source perspective, you will need in your program office, at least from my perspective, a strong architect who would be your technical evangelist, who would be your ambassador internally within the company to go and help you advocating consumption and contribution to open source. And because of that, they need to be able to understand the technology and see how the different pieces of open source can fit in the architecture you're trying to implement. So now all the software architects in this room can go and ask for a raise because of the additional work. Technical evangelist, this is a role that works both ways within the company and outside the company. So from evangelism perspective, I see this role as very critical because as a company, you may be contributing to projects, but also you can be open sourcing internal technology that you have. So in your case, in energy, you may be moving new projects, putting them in LF Energy and trying to incubate them there. So you need to have technical evangelists who would go to conferences, to other project communities and speak about the project from a technical perspective and help you build that community. And within the company, they do the same, but towards other teams. Compliance engineers, as a company that uses open source code to build your products or services, once you ship the product or you make the service online, you need to respect the licenses. And you need to have staff who would do the compliance work. And this is single, it's not plurals, right? So depending on the size of the company, the compliance function can be maybe 100 people for really large companies. It's you notice there's no S's, it's all singular, and you can scale it and add more people as you go. And some companies have hundreds of people focused on open source, so it depends on how much you're investing in this. You need legal support, so you need to have not necessarily a full-time legal counsel just for open source, but you need to have access to a legal counsel who has the open source knowledge. And of course, as you grow, and if you look at the large companies who have significant investment in open source, they have multiple lawyers who are exclusively focused on open source. So that function, similar to the others, can scale and grow with your activities. So what do they do? A lot of stuff. So I will go through it line by line, just because there's so much here. Develop and execute open source strategy. And this is basically your to-do list. So once you decide, okay, open source is part of our digital transformation efforts, and we cannot go and create all the software by ourselves. We need to collaborate with others. We need to invest in open source and reuse. And you know, once you made that decision, and most of you have already done that, you need to have a certain oversight on your open source investment, and you know how source is being consumed, how source code is leaving the company, how you're meeting your legal obligations, and all of these. Then you need to set up a team, and that team happens to be called OSPO. Okay, that's a very easy way of saying it. So what does this team does? So execute open source strategy. So everything on this list can be like a homework for your companies, really, to figure in your journey of building that open source presence. Oversee compliance. So you can have resources within the open source team to implement compliance tooling, processes, policies, guidelines, and so on, or you can just be the policy police across the company and have other teams do the implementations. Establish policies, processes, guidelines. This is mostly kind of the engine. Prioritize and drive upstream development. So, as I mentioned, you need to figure out the critical projects. Companies, kind of mature companies in their open source journey, they rely on hundreds and thousands of open source projects. So if you go to like the large tech companies in Silicon Valley, you know, they have, you know, most of them have, you know, hundreds of open source projects that they made available, they open source. So it's, from a consumption perspective, you cannot go and invest people and resources in all the projects you use. You need to figure out what are the top, you know, 15, 20, 25 projects that are really critical to my company as an energy, you know, creator or distributor or whatnot, and then focus on the top projects. Otherwise, not a single company, no matter how big or rich it is, has resources to spread across all the hundreds of projects you use. And use that as a way to prioritize your investments in projects. Work with Open Source Foundation. A lot of the projects are hosted in foundations. A lot of the events, major open source events, are run by foundations. You know, LF Energy is a foundation within the LF. So figuring out what projects that are critical to you are actually in foundations. Become a member, become active, and actually what I call this, you know, being on the table. So everybody, I think it's a lot better to be on the table than to be on the menu, right? And and generally, if you look at a lot of the companies, you know, I mentioned Ericsson because I worked for them. You know, Ericsson 20 years ago didn't embrace, I think, that transformation fast enough, right? And they used to be like Fortune 100 company 20 years ago. Today, they're just another company, and there's like hundreds of other companies, you know, like them. Nortel doesn't exist anymore. Sun doesn't exist anymore. You know, there are a lot of companies that actually missed that transformation, and they were on the menu and they were swallowed. Okay, so you want to be on the table. Track performance metrics. How do you tell your efforts are coming to fruits? You know, are fruitful. So you need to create metrics to figure out that the efforts you're doing are actually leading to the desired results. And we'll talk about these later on. Implement inner sourcing practices. I mentioned this very, very briefly. I think I have a few slides on this later on. But basically, what can we learn from open source development practices that we can bring and implement inside our company so that our developers can work smarter and be more efficient in their development and learn from these open source practices. Grow open source talent inside the company, training, mentorship programs. Be the advisor so that the people working in this office, they will be the advisor on open source to the rest of the company. Manage IT infrastructure. Eliminate friction from using or contributing. So basically the role of this office at a high level is identify challenges in using open source within the company, identify challenges in contributing to open source, and work to eliminate these challenges. Okay. Support corporate developments. When your companies will go and buy another company or do an acquisition in that sense or a merger, there's due diligence to be done and in terms of open source, and this office helped with us. Collaborate with universities on open source project. This is really a high potential that very few companies take advantage of. And actually, one of my favorite is to say no. And I actually had a presentation a couple of months ago in New York, and talking about different things, but I said, people expect you as the open source leader in the company to support all open source initiatives and projects. And actually, they're very surprised when they come to me and I say no. Okay, and they're very, why are you not supporting of this? And that's your job. I said, no, my job is to make sure that if we have something in the company, we want to take and make open source and grow a community and get collaborators for it. I want to make sure we have chances of success. So if you bring something to me and it doesn't meet my criteria for success once it goes out, we have to block it until we believe that it's going to be successful. Okay, and this is very much in line of something I said earlier this morning about kind of don't dump code and disappear, right? So any kind of code that is leaving the company or any kind of project you want to collaborate with and launch from scratch, it needs to meet some level of criteria to make sure that it has chances of survival. And there are millions and millions of projects out there. I mean, GitHub has, I don't know, 60, 90, 100 million repos there. One plus one more project or minus one project, nobody's going to notice. So you're going to be one in 100 million. So we need to make sure if something doesn't meet the criteria to success, we're not going to let it go. So these are kind of the primary function, responsibility of the team, within that. This is from the survey. So when you see a slide like this, it's coming from the survey. So what we saw, this is the open source program survey, and the question is, what are the primary responsibilities of the open source program? Okay, so, and this is from the Linux Foundation members and others who answered the survey. Foster culture. So it's very interesting that create open source culture in the company is actually the #1 highest rated by all the people that answered to the survey. Maintain compliance, execute open source strategy, communicate the strategy, and then everything else is, infrastructure, use, and contribute. So you can see there was actually a lot of emphasis on culture and compliance really at the top versus you would think, contribution or use. You can use that as your guideline to what the responsibilities of the office. And this is basically what other companies are using in this office in kind of a random, classified order of importance. So companies with open source programs are more likely to contribute code, recruit open source developers, and launch new projects. So when you, yes, please.
I have a question on the previous slide.
Yes?
Thank you. Question on the previous slide, and I'm Paulus Karmans from IT from Alliander. I was wondering regarding the compliance, if you are referring to license compliance or possibly also like security requirements being put internal or externally,
yes.
Or both?
So the question here is specific to license compliance, this question. However, it is kind of norm for people in that office to oversee kind of security as well. And actually a lot of the compliance tooling available, all tools available to verify the license and the incoming origin of the different components also provide alerts on security vulnerabilities. So the people or the staff that are doing the source code scans for compliance purposes have also visibility into security vulnerabilities that will show up in the tools and say, these components, these open source components have these security vulnerabilities. They're level 1, 2, 3, and mitigation suggestions. Yeah. So you can see from here what companies that have such a program, open source program or program office, also have better chances in recruiting, highly qualified staff or engineers, and they're more likely to launch new projects and attract contributors and developers. And this is kind of very natural. I mean, we kind of knew this, but the survey just reinforces the idea that if you have a proper function, or if you create open source program office, you can tell your recruits, hey, we have an open source program office and we're building the open source program within the company and we want to be a strong contributor, we want to influence project. It gives you a lot more confidence in recruiting and also in launching new projects versus, let's say you don't have that program and you want to go hire open source developers. That's the first thing they will ask you. How are we structured? Where do we fit? Do we have program office? Okay, so it's extremely helpful in these cases. However, there are a lot of challenges. And I tried to group these challenges in kind of different categories. So there's challenges related to culture. And remember from the survey, the number one influence of open source program office is to support the culture of open source within the company. So there's different cultural challenges you will come across. Development model, how development is done within the company versus how it's done outside, collaboration, transparency, how teams are actually formed and interact with each other, how do you hire people, and how do you measure the performance of people, okay? And this is a very interesting question. So one example on metrics. So let's say you have a developer in a typical environment today, and they have to implement a certain feature. And if they implement it on time, and it's included in the product, they get their bonus at the end of the year. Okay, this is kind of simplified, but that's how it works. So the developer works throughout the year, they implement the feature, it gets pushed into the software that managed electricity distribution, it's great. At the end of the year, the manager rates the performance as meet expectation or exceed expectation, the engineer gets their bonus. But this model doesn't work with open source because now that engineer is now working on projects in LF Energy, just as an example. Okay, and there are other people working on this project. And the assignment to the engineer is still to implement a feature within that specific project, but with other people. So now that engineer goes to the community and work for months and is able to recruit other developers, and the implementation is done via the community. So the engineer may have contributed source code, may not have been contributed. So now it's the end of the year and you want to evaluate the performance. How would you evaluate the performance? Let's say the engineer didn't write any single line of code, but because of their effort, they were able to lobby other participants to write the code and get it success. So would that developer get 100% of their bonus or 0% or whatever, right? So you can see in many cases, from a performance and success metrics, the open source developer may have done a great job, but that doesn't translate to how things are done within the company from an HR perspective. Okay, so processes within the company, governance, how open source is being governed inside the company, how source code is coming in, leaving the company, compliance, how approvals are done, right? And that's earlier today I mentioned simplifying the approval process, because as your activities in open source grow, you're going to have a lot of approvals coming to your inbox, okay? And it can be first, few of them every week, then few of them every day, then hundreds of them every day, then it's out of control, okay? So basically, we need to figure out a way to minimize the approval process so you don't have to approve every single aspect. And one of the things I did actually, and it's a practice in open source offices, is that they have a blanket approval. So developer A working on the kernel, just as an example, they are approved once a year for the whole year because we know that that person is actually hired to work in the kernel community and that's it. So there are different ways you can do that and allow kind of less heavy bureaucracy in the approval process. And how do you operate that program? In terms of tooling, IT infrastructure, you need, build servers, you need, cloud access, Azure or AWS or others, development tools, servers, access. A lot of companies have different firewalls blocking access to different sites. That has to change. Code reuse, and, there's a lot of tooling that you can use as part of IT to enable all that open source work. Continuity is very important. That covers strategy, projects, priorities, funding, and many other things. You may have an executive sponsor today who supports the open source program office, but then what happens if that executive leaves the company or moves to a different position? Would you lose the support, right? So continuity, having that long-term view and long-term execution. So we're starting a PMO office now, and we know that it will exist still in 3 years because not all projects are short-term. But we know it will exist, but we may not know in what shape or form. That's fine, because things happen, but you need to have that continuity of strategy and implementation. And education is a big challenge, and I think education happens at all levels, whether you're educating your executives or your developers or your peers, and it also happens on different domains. It can be technical education, it can be legal, it can be compliance related. So there's a lot of areas, and most companies actually either develop their own training and deliver it to employees, or hire a company that comes in and do that for them. And in many cases, I've personally developed training for different companies I worked at and delivered sessions like this. And we had what we call train the trainer philosophy, where in large companies you cannot have just 5 people going around a company of 50,000 developers and training everybody. It's not scalable. So you need to kind of train the team leads, and team leads train their engineers and so on. So a lot of challenges that, as step number 1, you have to be aware of, and you may face all of them. You may face some of them. Maybe just looking at the chart, you will say, well, I can at least identify 4 or 5 of them that I will challenges I will face this year, and kind of try to focus on figuring out ways to mitigate these challenges. And also from the survey, as a follow-up to my challenges slide, is we asked the question to the participants on challenges they face in their open source program offices. And the first one is figuring out the strategy, or how to even create a strategy and approach it. And this was the highest, the common challenge across everyone that responded to the survey. Setting a policy, open source policy. What's the company's, if I ask any of you, what's your company's policy, open source policy? Say, let's say there are 10 people working for the same company in this room, and I ask the same question, I may get different answer, okay? So the goal is to have a simple policy that everybody understands it and it's well communicated to everyone. Getting support and buy-in. So you may have an executive that supports that effort now, but that executive will not be around maybe in a year. And as a funny story, I was working for a company. I worked there for a few years, and as part of the company culture, they have executive rotation. And every year I had a different boss. True story. Okay, so I worked there for over 6 years, and every year I had a different boss. And every year I had to train my boss to continue supporting my team. So executive support is extremely critical, because that function is a cost center. You're not a P&L, so you consume money, but you don't produce money, right? So it's very critical. Setting up a budget, and hiring a program manager, or a lead for the team. So these kind of give you insights into how other companies are kind of struggling through this transformation in different industries. This is not energy specific. And in a later talk today, I will actually go through very detailed examples of these things.